Welcome everybody to this incredibly exciting panel discussion on the topic of understanding Japanese whiskey. My name is James Bowker. I'm the UK ambassador for House of Suntory, so I'm not going to be taking a particularly prevalent role in this panel, except to ask some questions of our amazing panelists that we have joining us today. And I wanted to just begin this talk by taking the opportunity to humbly thank these three panelists for joining us. It's a very rare and exciting opportunity to get three representatives and very senior and very experienced, educated representatives from three of the most important and prominent brands within the world of Japanese whiskey. So joining us today from Nikka, we have, of course, Sakuma Tadashi. So Sakuma is going to have a chance to introduce himself properly in just a moment, but he is the master blender for Nikka. We also have Yumi joining us from Chichibu, the queen of Japanese whiskey, as it were. Yumi and I have known each other for many years now, and it's really exciting to have her to tell us about this slightly newer distillery, Chichibu, in the world and history of Japanese whiskey. And finally, from Suntory, we have the inimitable Mike Miyamoto, who has been with the company for an incredibly long time and has an amazing amount of knowledge and wisdom to share with us all. So thank you so much to all three of you for taking time out of what is an incredibly busy time of year and an incredibly difficult year, particularly, I think, in Japan. So thank you for your time, your patience, and your efforts in organizing this with us. Before we jump into the topics at hand, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context as to why Tales of the Cocktail and myself are so excited to host this panel discussion with all of you around the world. I've been very lucky to spend around 12 years now in the hospitality industry and was really privileged to try Japanese whiskey right at the beginning of that period and work in a variety of outstanding bars in Tokyo, in London and around the UK, trying to understand Japanese whiskey better. And throughout that time, I've been lucky to educate consumers, bartenders, owners, operators about this exciting industry. And there's so much interest. We've seen an absolute explosion in the passion people have for this whiskey region. And what's really interesting is that as I've traveled around educating people about Japanese whiskey, there's been a real comment coming back to me that we love this product, we love these flavors, but maybe we have less of an understanding of the category as a whole compared to some of those more traditional whiskey regions like Scotland, Ireland, and America. So we're really, really pleased to bring together three leading experts in the category to help us understand where maybe some commonalities might lie, so that as a community, as international bartenders, we can start to understand much more deeply what makes Japanese whiskey so exciting, so unique, and so special. So we've seen around 100 years of history, starting, of course, back in 1899, running through Kyoto, through the incredible stories of Taketsuru traveling to Scotland, the founding of Yamazaki, and then 10 years later, we see Yoichi coming through, 50s and 60s, this economic boom in Japan, eventually leading to this resurgence that we're seeing now in Japanese whiskey and countless new distilleries opening. We're going to explore all of that today. But that is plenty of context, I think, for this discussion. As I say, I now work for Suntory, so I want to take a little bit of a step back because I don't want this to be biased or led by myself or by Suntory. So the panelists and myself have agreed 5 questions, 5 topics to discuss together today. And without further ado, I'd love to jump into getting to know our panelists just a little bit better and then exploring these 5 questions together to find a little bit more information about this incredible category of Japanese whiskey. So I'd love to begin by welcoming Yumi. I don't know if you'd be prepared to introduce yourself and maybe just tell us a little bit about Chichibu. Welcome, Yumi.
Thank you very much, James. And thank you very much for the great opportunity. I've been working in the hospitality industry since when I was 19. Then like Nikka and Suntory, that's kind of like a dreaming whiskey. So it's a really great opportunity for me. Then I'm working for Chichibu Distillery as a global brand ambassador. Then I used to be introducing about Chichibu Distillery as one of the youngest distillery in Japan. But now it's already 13 years since we started from 2008. Then recently, many small distilleries popping up in Japan. So maybe we are now no longer youngest distillery in Japan, but we still have, we only have 10 years and a little bit. So still kind of baby of the industry in Japan. But small company has a lot of opportunity and also possibilities in the future. Our production is kind of back to tradition. So following to the very standard and classical way, which came from Scotland. So maybe you guys can find very nice, exciting product from our distillery now and also the future too. Thank you very much for the great opportunity.
Thank you, Yumi. A real pleasure to have you with us. And as you say, it's been fascinating watching what's happened with Chichibu. Pretty much my entire career has been spanned by Chichibu first starting and now where we find ourselves today. And it's been wonderful to watch your products come through and see how the distillery has evolved over that 12 years or so. So thank you so much, Yumi, for joining us. And I send my love to Icharo and the team over at the Chichibu distillery. I'd now love to take the opportunity to welcome Sakuma Tadashi from Nika. Sakuma-san, I wonder if you'd perhaps just introduce yourself and again, just tell us a little bit about Nika.
Well, yes, I joined Nika in 40 years ago, and I'm still working for Nika as a senior chief blender. So actually, we Nika started 1934. So almost 90 years history. Recently many new distilleries coming to Japan and started whiskey distillery. However, so it's quite difficult for them to create some their position, because since just say 10 years or 5 years, 3 years, it's quite difficult to establish their own style. So, but future is very so bright, and we are also expecting the whiskey industry Japan more so great and extend. Yes.
Yes, and as you say there, it's incredibly exciting to see how many new distilleries are popping up and what might happen in the future, not just in terms of the newer distilleries, but also as we see traditional distilleries like Yoichi, Miyagi-Kyo, Hakusha, and Yamazaki, how they'll continue to evolve. So thank you so much for that introduction to Nika. And finally, Mike Miyamoto, one of my colleagues, pleasure to have you with us. Again, if you'd be able to just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about Suntory.
Thank you very much, James, for the introduction. And also, I really appreciate the opportunity given to us to have this sort of very nice event. And also, only through the Zoom, but it's a great opportunity to see Yumi-san and Sakuma-san. And it's been a long time since we met in the last time. Sometimes we come across and somewhere in the world to see each other and say hello to each other, and also work, very hard to actually promote Japanese whiskey as itself. And just coming back to myself, and I am Mike Miyamoto, now a global brand ambassador of Suntory Whiskey. But I joined Suntory in 1978. It's been about 43 years since I got involved with whiskey business. And not only in Japan, but also I have experience in working in the Scottish whiskey industry. We owned small distillery in Bowker, Auchentoshan, and Glengarry then. And I was a production director and the deputy managing director there, and to promote the Bowker brand, the Auchentoshan brand. But still, my heart is with Japanese whiskey. And I'm glad and also pleased to be here you know, represent Japanese whiskey, you know, with Yumi-san and Sakuma-san. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And what's really exciting for everybody watching this panel discussion and for myself, we're all bartenders at heart, and to have three panelists who are able to provide two sides of the coin in terms of educating us about Japanese whiskey. All three of these panelists are avid lovers of the liquid themselves, whiskey drinkers, and people who love the history and culture of Japanese whiskey. So they can tell us all about the flavors, the culture, and the history of Japan, but also all three of these people have an intimate understanding of the production and how these spirits are actually made in each of these distilleries. So we have a really unique insight from these three panelists today. So I wanted to jump straight in immediately with our first question. And it's something that comes up for me in many of the training sessions and seminars that I host when traveling around in my current work with Suntory. And it's to do with the difference primarily in the palates, or the perceived difference perhaps in the palates of the Western cultures versus East Asian and particularly Japanese culture. And I just wanted to ask you each to spend a couple of moments thinking about whether you notice any differences in the Japanese palate, i.e. the flavors that are enjoyed in Japan compared to perhaps the palates of Scotland, America, or other traditional whiskey regions. So I think in this instance, Yumi, I'm going to come to yourself first, if that's okay. Perhaps you could just tell us, do you notice any difference at all in the Japanese palate versus the Western palate?
It's a really difficult question, but definitely what we are eating in the culture, it affects to the product. For example, we Japanese eat seaweed a lot, for example, with miso soup. Then before, when I was in Scotland, I was talking with my friend and she said, what seaweed is? Like, this is kind of black, sticky, something weird plant. Then she doesn't really understand about the taste and flavor of seaweed. We call it like a wakame or kombu, but definitely we can find kind of umami flavor from the whiskey. So sometimes we can find that kind of flavor from the blended whiskey, for example, from Japanese whiskey. Then on the other hand, if we go to Scotland, I haven't really tasted the, for example, toffee when I was a child. So sometimes people are describing like, this is like a toffee, but I didn't really understand. Is it like a caramel or something? But no, this is toffee. So definitely Scotch whiskey has kind of toffee flavor because they know how the taste is. So like this, our palate is relating to the culture and also with the food, like comfort food from each countries. So sometimes I can see the difference in the, especially in the blended whiskey, because it's made by blending technique of each country. So it can be really interesting difference, I think.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's fascinating that you mentioned that, because you talked about comfort foods. And one of the examples I've heard countless times from bartenders here in London is talking about their comforting drink in the morning. I've just finished a cup of English breakfast tea, but I think for many Westerners it's coffee, where in Japan it might be green tea. And even in that very simple, perhaps flippant example, you see this difference in intensity from the power of an espresso versus that delicacy of a green tea. So thank you so much for highlighting the importance of the cultural differences in terms of the flavors. I don't know if Tadashi-san, would you have anything to say about the difference in palate from your personal perspective between West and Japan?
Well, so taste varies from person to person, so it is not possible to make it general determination. Each country has, of course, each country has different eating habits and different type of cuisine. So, say, even if you are a Westerner, if you are born and raised in Japan, your taste buds will be like Japanese. So, but this may affect a difference in taste between Japanese and Westerners. Basically, Japanese cuisine has a delicate taste. So this may affect some differences, but I don't know how that affects people's whiskey preference, actually. Yeah.
Fantastic. So that's a really, really useful and quite a nuanced answer. And just to reiterate what you said there, to ensure that everyone watching is understanding, there was this really important point that we all have different palates. It's not so easy to say that, you know, the Japan flavor favors one style of flavor versus Britain or America favoring a different type of flavor. What we hear there from Tadashi is, of course, we're all unique, but the nuance arises when we realize that, of course, we all grow up in the context of our individual culture. And if we're exposed to more delicate flavors, as perhaps people might be in Japan, then maybe that has an influence. But I think Sakuma-san is very wise to say that it's very hard to pinpoint exactly how that might impact our perception and enjoyment of different types of whiskey. I hope, Tadashi, was that a fair explanation of what you were saying there?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And finally, of course, Mike, over to you. Do you have any thoughts to share with us on this topic?
Well, first of all, I mostly agree with the Yumi's and also Sakuma-san's opinions about the difference in palate. And as a human being, we have all 5 senses in common, and particularly tasting buds. And I don't know, you know, it doesn't make any difference between Japanese or Westerners in terms of the senses. But as Yumi said, it depends on how you grow up, and also Sakuma-san said, and how you actually face the culture and the food and eating habit and in your history. And unless you have tasted something, how can you describe that taste? You see, it's impossible. Like Yumi says, you know, miso soup, vice versa, maybe toffee. To me, that, you know, first time I went to United States, the kids love to, you know, enjoy licorice candy. I never tasted licorice before. What's that licorice? You know, that sort of thing. And also the Mizunara, Suntory always tell the people, consumers, and whiskey lovers about Mizunara. But unless you tasted, you know, flavor Mizunara, you can't find out what it is. And so in order to describe Mizunara flavor, we just use the terms cinnamon-like flavor, although it's not the cinnamon at all. But unless you actually, you know, felt the Japanese incense or Japanese persimmon taste, otherwise it's difficult to actually imagine what's the flavor like of in Mizunara. So that's the thing, you see. It depends on how you actually grow up, and also your history, and also the food you actually encountered.
That's actually an incredibly fascinating point that Mike's brought up there, which is to build on what we've heard already from Tadashi-san and Yumi, is this idea that sometimes there are flavors in whiskey, perhaps from Mizunara, perhaps from various forms of fermentation from, again, Mizunara we see at Chichibu, through all different ways that whiskey is aged and made at Nika, that maybe there are some unique flavor profiles that we might find in Japanese whiskey that are very hard to describe in a language that doesn't have an understanding necessarily of some of the flavors we find in Japan. So that's a really interesting thought, because of course, people like me, bartenders, you know, when we're tasting the great whiskies that each of your 3 companies make, you know, we might taste them and go, there's something there, I don't quite know how to describe it. And as you say, Mike, we might say cinnamon, when in fact, that's purely because the Japanese language, the Japanese culture has a word to describe that unique flavor that maybe doesn't exist in English. So that's a fascinating insight that we've got from you. So thank you, all 3 of you, for that. I just wanted to now move on to some more questions, if that's okay with you. So thank you. Those were some fascinating insights that we just covered regarding the palate of Japanese whiskey, Japanese people and perhaps Western cultures. Yumi, I just wanted to follow up very briefly. You mentioned umami, and I think this is something that perhaps the 4 of us on the panel are quite aware of, but maybe not everyone is. Would you be able to tell us just a little bit more about umami and what you meant by it in this context?
maybe easiest way if you want to find umami, maybe if you just buy some seaweed, like dried seaweed, and if you chew it, maybe you can find it. Because umami is not just, for example, sweet or savory, it's something in between. Then still, I'm Japanese, but I'm still trying to find a way to describe umami. So maybe if you experience it, it's easiest way to find it. So just go to the supermarket.
Fantastic. That's good advice. You know, the only way to experience it is to try it. Mike, did you have anything you'd like to add to umami and what we mean by umami?
I think most of the cuisine have the umami taste in the food, and but umami was found by Japanese. It's the latest taste among the 5 other tasting principles. I think newest one is umami, and umami was found by Japanese. So umami exists in like Yumi said, in seaweed and also Japanese mushrooms, shiitake, and also other stuff. Katsuo, it's bonito, dried bonito, and Japanese really understood, those items really produce and generates very, very profound taste in the food. And so, as Yumi suggested, that you better try and buy some, seaweed, dry seaweed, and chew it. Then you'll find it. And also, there is a bit of umami elements in the Scottish broth, also French soup, consomme. That will be, umami taste in there.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, and as you say, the fifth and newest of the 5 basic tastes as we understand them. So just to clarify what those were sweet and sour, salty and bitter, and very recently, as Mike has pointed out, we've discovered this idea of umami. Tadashi-san, did you have anything you wanted to add about umami, perhaps how it applies to whiskey?
Well, so umami is not something special to Japan, because actually, so Mike-san said umami found by Japanese people, and some kind of amino acid gives such taste. However, and also Japanese has some words for umami, but Western people doesn't have umami as a word. That's why umami is something too special Japanese, but I don't think so. Mike-san says Scotch broth and the French consomme has also umami. That is not special, yeah, very common. Not taste, but common, say, feelings of taste, yeah.
Thank you. So that's a fascinating insight into Japanese flavors, understanding umami. So great to get 3 perspectives from people who obviously live, work, and grew up in Japan. So thank you for clarifying that for us. Now, I wanted to now jump into our second question that we had discussed, and this is really about understanding each of your individual philosophies or ideas or ways of thinking about Japanese whiskey as a category. And I'm going to leave this quite open. I'm not actually going to phrase it as too specific a question, but rather give you the complete freedom for several minutes to just tell us how you think about Japanese whiskey, as I say, as an entirety, as a category. So I think we'll first actually this time come to you, Mike. Do you have any thoughts that you'd like to start us off with? As Suntory was, of course, the first of our distilleries, I figure I should come to you first.
Well, generally speaking, Japanese whiskey started back in 1923 when Yamazaki distillery was built. And at that time, the founder of Suntory, Shinjiro Tori, wanted to create the authentic Japanese whiskey in Japan. But unfortunately, he didn't know how. But fortunately, the founder of Nikka, Mr. Taketsuru, who actually went out to study Scotch whiskey making at that time and came back to Japan. And Shinjiro really wanted to make whiskey in Japan and asked Taketsuru-san to join Suntory and help him build a Yamazaki distillery. That's why, you know, our style of whiskey making is very similar to Scotch whiskey distilling. You see, that's a sort of a unique history of Japanese whiskey. We didn't follow the American style. Well, we didn't follow the Canadian style. You know, we didn't exactly follow the Irish whiskey style. And but in Suntory, although, you know, a distillery was there, and also Scottish style of distilling, but Shinjiro Tori really pursued the Japanese taste. Because that time, when at that time, you know, almost 100 years ago, the whiskey taste from Scotland was very, very strong and characteristic. And Shinjiro Tori didn't want to make that sort of, flavor. And so he really wanted to create the very, very sophisticated taste, which actually accepted by the Japanese taste. So since then, we actually tried to make subtle, refined, yet complex whiskey through the history of Japanese Suntory whiskey making. And in order to actually achieve the subtle, refined, yet complex taste, we have to use the blending technique, and also we have to use so many different styles of water. And that's why we have a different location of 2 distilleries, and also different styles of fermenters and also the cask styles. Then creating the very nice blend which appeal to the very sensitive Japanese palate. Thus, we actually built up our whiskey in Suntory.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mike, for explaining that for us. Sakuma-san, would you like to add any thoughts about how Nika conceptualizes Japanese whiskey?
I say I don't believe that Scotch whiskey and Japanese whiskey have separate profile, because Miyamoto-san, Mike-san say, as our founder, learned making whiskey in Scotland. Basically, so each whiskey is made from same ingredient, malted barley, and say corn or wheat is quite different, but any process is same and aged in the same casks. So that's why basically Japanese whiskey and Scotch whiskey is not different style, I think. But since Japan is long from north to south, the climate varies so greatly from region to region. Scotland is almost same climate every distillery is, but Japan is quite long and north and south, very cold and very hot. So that's, I don't think the lump of all Japanese whiskey together, but I think that more about difference in quality between different, say, manufacturers, I think.
Thank you, Sakuma-san. Yeah, that's fascinating. And to kind of summarize some of the thoughts we've heard from Mike and Sakuma-san there, it's that what Mike was pointing out was the idea that actually, the blenders, the people producing, distilling and creating these whiskies are perhaps aiming for a particular end product. So you use that quote, subtle, delicate and refined, Mike, which was, I think, really insightful in terms of helping us to understand maybe what the Suntory blenders are aiming for. But then Sakuma again comes through with this lovely analysis, which points out that really there's a lot of similarities. In many ways, there's no difference between Scottish and Japanese whiskey. There's the same raw material, many of the same production methods, and so on and so forth. But what does differ is, in particular, the climate of Japan. So Japan, as Sakuma-san has just mentioned, has a much more varied climate than we might find in Speyside or in Islay, where you see huge temperature variations and so on. So that's how we can start to see the impact of, not to use a word that's too controversial, but things like terroir, understanding how our location, our climate, and our culture impacts our whiskey. So thank you both, Mike and Tadashi, for those thoughts. Yumi, as a much more recent newcomer, I suppose, to the Japanese whiskey industry, at a proud 13 years of age at the Chichibu distillery, what are yours and Ichiro-san's thoughts on understanding and conceptualizing Japanese whiskey as a category?
Okay, well, actually, I've been thinking about the answer of this question because, if I'm traveling around the world and sometimes standing at the stand and many people coming to me, then asking same question, like tons of same question. What's the difference between Scotch whiskey and Japanese whiskey? Then it's bugging me, and I've been thinking about that. Then recently, I found the hint of the difference, like just a week ago or 2 weeks ago. Then, like Mike-san said about the history and also Sakuma-san's idea, like Japanese whiskey, we don't have only one category or one flavor. So it's really difficult to describe with only one word. Japanese whiskey is like this. But from the history or our product, I thought Japanese whiskey or whiskey in Japan is made from like diversity and inclusion. Because the good example is world whiskey category. Recently, like for example, Ichiro's Malt and Grain, world blended whiskey, and also AO from Suntory. Because whiskey making country is not only Japan, but also all over the world. So we just forget about the border, then trying to find good whiskey, then bring it back to Japan, then sometimes they get matured and making blend. Then it's created our own culture because I never seen world whiskey in Scotland or maybe US. This is kind of our own culture. So we just not borrowed someone's culture or mimicked someone's whiskey. It's observed and we use it for development. So that's why we could create our own category like world whiskey. But on the other hand, like Ichiro's Malt, we also have very traditional single malt whiskey following the Scottish way. So we have both of them. And also in addition, we don't have the guys from Kirin here today, but their origin is not only from Europe or Scotland, but also they have idea of American whiskey way. Then the product is actually well received from consumers in Japan. So like our culture is made by many different style and culture from all over the world, and we use it and making new category by ourselves. This is kind of the idea of whiskey in Japan.
That's fascinating. And
may I while Yumi was describing about the conceptual thinking of Japanese whiskey, and I just came up with the idea that the ramen, we actually imported ramen from China, how to make ramen, but we developed ramen into Japanese style. Whiskey, the same thing. We import how to make whiskey from the foreign countries, but within ourselves, we actually developed and also created something different from the original, whiskey. Then we actually bring up something slightly different from the original ones, and also developing further. Then nowadays, the people realize themselves, particularly whiskey lovers, find themselves difference between Japanese whiskey and the Scotch and other bourbons and Canadian whiskeys. So to me, that the ramen culture may be the sort of easy way to understand what Japanese whiskey is.
That's a really fascinating insight from both of you, actually. And it reminds me of a concept that I've understood to be called kaizen, this idea of continual refinement or improvement that we see in Japanese culture, always asking, what can we do to refine this even further? And actually, I think we see three interrelated, nuanced and slightly different answers to our question here in terms of understanding the difference between Japanese whiskey and whiskies made in traditional regions. So Mike started us off by talking about the intentions of the blender and the distiller, and this idea of creating a style of whiskey made for the Japanese people and the Japanese flavor preferences, this idea of being subtle, delicate, complex, and refined. And then we also hear from Tadashi-san this idea of how the place impacts things. So on one hand, you've got the impact of the decisions made by blenders and their preferences, but on the other hand, you've got the impact of the place. And lastly, Yumi and Mike have then just brought in this third and final element, which is the impact of the history and culture of Japan. Japan is very much a melting pot of influences from all over the whiskey world. So primarily Nikka and Suntory might find their influence in Scottish whiskey distilleries, but places like Kirin's Fuji Katemba distillery that Yumi just mentioned maybe are more inspired by bourbon traditions. So what we see is this threefold answer to our question. Firstly, there's a difference in the aims of the producers. Secondly, there's a difference in the climate and how that impacts the flavor as the whiskey ages. And finally, as Mike and Yumi have elaborated for us, you see all of these different whiskey cultures, these production methods coming together into this harmonious kind of creation of a whole new category. And Yumi, I love the fact that you brought up that we have the category of Japanese whiskey that we're discussing today, but we also have amazing innovations coming from Japan in terms of a brand new category of world whiskey. Now, we're not discussing the world blends too much today, but it's fascinating to see how those innovations from around the world are coming to fruition within Japan. So a fascinating insight there. Thank you all for those. So thank you. I wanted to now move to our third topic for discussion, which is to start to understand a little bit more about the production methods in each of your distilleries, because we've talked so far about how, you know, the Japanese industry has been inspired by the industry in Scotland, but also to a lesser extent by the industries in Canada, Ireland, and America. And really, I wanted to seek a greater understanding in each of your distilleries that you guys come from. What are you doing in terms of production that may be similar? But also, what are you doing in terms of production that might be unique to yourselves, or at least unique to Japan? So in fact, I'm going to come first to yourself, Sakuma-san from Nikka. If you could just tell us a little bit about Nikka's production, because I know, of course, that we see the original founder who went to Scotland. So it seems very logical to begin with you today. So would you mind telling us?
Yes, but there are very few differences with Scotch whiskey and Japanese whiskey, as I mentioned before. Unique style is our copper pot still heated by direct coal fire. This will be dismissed in Scotland maybe 15 years ago, I think. But so compared to American whiskeys, there are so many different, many different. We don't have such American style equipment. Even if almost all Japanese distilleries have Scotch style equipment, except Kirin. So it's quite difficult to the method to making difference between Japanese and American. However, so very few American malt distilleries existing. However, my knowledge of American malt whiskey distilleries is very limited. So I don't say nothing. Yeah.
Thank you, Sakuma-san. And Mike, do you have anything to add to that? Does Suntory have anything about their production that is either similar or different from other whiskey regions that's worth highlighting to help us understand the category a bit more?
As I answered in the previous question, that we learned how to make whiskey from Scotland. So basic style of whiskey making is no different from Scottish style. But having said that, as a Suntory, we try to pursue the Japanese taste. In order to achieve that taste, we really have to consider so many other aspects, except for the whiskey production, equipment in pot stills and fermenters. First of all, we have to consider the quality of water. In Japan, water is very, very clear and clean and very nice in quality compared to the other countries. And also the water itself is soft. All right. And we found that soft water is, very ideal to the Scottish style of whiskey making. On the contrary, America, in the United States, some of them tried, as Sakuma-san described, some of them tried to make the Scottish style malt whiskey distillery, but using the maybe hard water may result in the difficulty of achieve the quality they need, you see. And thanks to the water quality we have in Japan, the taste of Japanese whiskey is relatively softer and lighter to the Scottish style of whiskey, although we make the same style. And that's what we found out in Suntory. So we try to pursue nothing like Scottish style characteristic, but very moderate and subtle, refined yet complex taste. And that's a big difference between Scottish style and Japanese style, and also other styles.
Thank you, Mike. So what we've heard from yourself and Sakuma-san there is a real focus on that traditional Scottish method of making whiskey. We're still using malted barley, we're still fermenting it in the traditional way, we're then still double pot distilling it for the most part, except obviously there we do also make grain whiskies, both at Miyagi-Kyo and at Chita. But we've also heard from you that there are some subtle differences as well in production. So Mike, you're raising there the importance of water and how the softness of water that we find in Japan impacts that flavor. It makes it lighter, it makes it easier going, I suppose, on the palate. And earlier in today's discussion, you both also mentioned various ways throughout production that you've experimented with how to create different flavors. So we've mentioned different cask varieties. Mike, you also, I think, briefly mentioned about different fermentation types and various different peating levels and other factors. Would either of you have any more to add in terms of these differences in production that you employ in either of your distilleries? Sakuma-san, I'll come to you first. I don't know if you have any thoughts in terms of that difference in terms of the styles you produce in each of your distilleries.
Anyway, so each distillery using different yeast, I think. Actually, we are using 10 different types of yeast to make our whiskey. So, so quite difficult to say what does affect the quality of whiskey each distilleries. But so every small things affects some small effect, not such a large effect, I don't know, but it's that combination gives different type of whiskey each distilleries, I think. Yeah.
Yes, that's fascinating. It was something I remember. I have such fond memories. One of my favorite memories of being in Japan was the first time I visited the Miyagi-Kyo distillery with Amiko-san, and she showed us around and talked to us about what you're describing there, which is the use of different yeasts to then create different flavors during fermentations. And it's really important what you've pointed out, that these are subtle differences. So anyone that's tasting along at home or trying Japanese whiskies, don't panic if you don't notice a massive difference. It's never a massive difference between Scottish malts and Japanese malts, but there's these nuances, these subtleties. You could use a brewer's yeast, you could use a distiller's yeast, and all of these different varieties, 10 different varieties of yeast we've just heard from Tadashi-san there, that create slightly delicate different aromas in the whiskey during that fermentation process. Miyamoto-san, did you have any thoughts you wanted to add in terms of this variety through production with regards to Suntory at all?
Well, style of fermenters, basically we use wooden fermenters and stainless steel fermenters. The same thing goes to Scottish whiskey distillery. But most of the Scottish whiskey distillery actually stopped using the wooden fermenters because of the economical reason. But we stick to the wooden fermenters because the wooden fermenters try to preserve the lactobacillus, which is really effective to the latter part of fermentation, giving the kind of yogurt-like flavor, which is very important. That's why, although wooden fermenter is very difficult to handle, but we still stick to the wooden fermenters for the quality and the character we need. And also, Mizunara casks we use. It's very rare to find out Mizunara timber anymore in Japan, but still we try to find out some Mizunara timber in the northern region and try to create something, try to create some new Mizunara cask to actually continue the taste of Mizunara from the casks. So that's what we've been doing so far. This is not unique just in some Japanese, but unique to the other whiskey as well.
So that's fascinating. So what we're hearing there is quite a variety of different impacts in terms of the flavor. So you've got there different types of fermentation tanks, which obviously, as you say, impact the bacterial growth, which affects the flavor. You've got a huge variety of casks. You mentioned Mizunara. I know that all three of your distilleries, so I've seen countless different cask varieties at Chichibu, which I'm sure Yumi can tell us more about in a moment. I've seen the same from Suntory. We've seen sherry cask be used, red wine. We've seen Mizunara, of course, amongst many others. And again, the same goes for Nika. I've seen, of course, you've done recently some limited expressions from both Yoichi and Miyaki-Kyo experimenting with different cask types and indeed different still shapes. So all of these things will have an impact on the flavor and variety of flavors that blenders have at their disposal. So thank you both so much for telling us a little bit more about the ways in which variety is created, because that is, at least in my experience, quite different from the Scottish tradition. I was very lucky to visit two of my favorite distilleries, Macallan and Lefroy. And in these distilleries, every drop of liquid's the same until it goes in the cask. That's where they find their difference in aging. Whereas in Japan, you guys are discussing ways to create elements of difference during the actual process of fermentation distillation. So thank you for telling us more about that. Yumi, coming back to you, of course, we've mentioned Mizunara and fermentation. So I'm immediately thinking of one thing that's different for Chichibu, but would you be able to tell us something about the production of whiskey at Chichibu and how that impacts the flavors that you're able to create?
Well, I really completely agreed with Sakuma-san and Mike-san's idea, because production-wise, how do we make whiskey from milling process to maturation is, I can say that nearly 100% same as Scottish way, because we are following to the Scottish tradition. But like Sakuma-san said, like a small difference, like temperature or timing, is making the big difference in the product. Then also, if I'm talking about the Chichibu distillery, we are kind of newer distillery, but trying to be like traditional. Maybe I can say that more traditional than Scottish distillery. For example, trying the flour malting or trying to have cooperage and making cask by ourselves. for some of Mizunaru cask. So newer distilleries, so many people are dreaming about like new innovation from our distillery, but for us, innovation is tradition. So if we are trying to learn a lot of things from the tradition, it can be our innovation in the future. So if I can describe Chichibu Distillery, maybe I can say that it's back to tradition, very traditional distillery. That's what we are aiming to do.
Fantastic. That's fascinating. And thank you for clearing that up. And it's something that I've heard from a lot of different distillers as I've traveled around Japan, which is this real respect, this reverence for the traditional methods. And I think there's this great analogy in the world of wine that many bartenders will understand and appreciate. We've seen recently this resurgence in the idea of natural or biodynamic wines. And really, this is nothing new. These are simply very old techniques for winemaking that are coming back into the forefront of the fashions of wine. And what we're seeing in Japan arguably might be something similar, which is that this is a relatively new region for many people, but actually the production methods are, if anything, more traditional. They're more historically accurate than some things we might find in even places like Scotland or like Ireland, whether that's the use of the wooden mash tuns that we're seeing at Yamazaki, whether it's the Mizunara fermentation tanks and the smaller pot stills that we're seeing at Chichibu, or the coal-fired pot stills that we're seeing at Yoichi. So really fascinating to hear that whilst we might perceive Japanese whiskey as being incredibly innovative as Western bartenders or bartenders around the world, there's many ways in which that innovation finds its roots actually in accuracy and honesty to traditional methods of whiskey making that were found in Scotland 100 or more years ago. So thank you all so much for telling us a little bit more about your distilleries, about production, and about how there's this openness to trying these subtle differences throughout the production process, giving us as producers, blenders, distillers, a huge variety of flavors from which to create our finished product. So thank you all so much for that insight. So thank you all so much. We're going to move now to our final question. And it's one that really excites me. As I mentioned, I was super privileged to get to live out in Japan briefly. I was doing an apprenticeship at Bar High Five in Tokyo. And it was fascinating whilst working there that we had these two very different groups of drinkers. We had a lot of tourists, we had a lot of bartenders, we had chefs, but also business people who just had heard of the international reputation of this bar. And I knew how to serve those people. But we also had a lot of Japanese guests. And it was really clear to me that there was a very different culture of drinking whiskey in Japan versus perhaps where I've spent most of my career here in Europe. So I just wanted to take the chance to ask each of you, do you think that the culture of whiskey drinking in Japan is different to the culture of whiskey drinking in the West? And if it is different, how might that have impacted the whiskies that are being produced now in Japanese distilleries? So I'm actually going to come first to Yumi on this, because I know you've been traveling a lot, and I wondered if you could tell me about the differences in this whiskey drinking culture and how it affects Japanese whiskey in your experience or in your opinion.
I can say that it's completely kind of different, because when I was working in Highlander Inn in Scotland, it's like a center of the Speyside. I worked there for nearly 2 years, but I got the order of highball, whiskey and soda, only twice or 3 times from Japanese tourists. But no one was drinking highball. If they're living in Speyside or living in all over the world. So maybe highball is really common drink in Japan. Then if I go to bar or izakaya, first one will be highball, especially in the summertime, but it's not common around the world, I realized. But this is fantastic culture, I think, because we are different. And can you imagine, like now in Japan, the temperature is going up to 35 degrees and nearly 40 degrees sometimes, and humidity is really high, like maybe you feel like swimming in someone's mouth. But maybe such an occasion, you don't want to drink whiskey with neat. Highball is really good. Drinking highball under the sunshine is refreshing. This is a culture, and way to drink whiskey is coming from the culture. It's same as the process too. So each country has different style. So if we are drinking highball quite often, when we are making new product or blended whiskey or single malt whiskey, of course, our master blender or team of blending team is thinking about the highball as well. So when we are making new product, of course, we try whiskey as itself, maybe drop some water, and we're trying to make on the rocks and also highball, then trying the difference. Then when we think, this is really good for the occasion in Japan, then we launch it. Maybe this kind of process is making a small difference for the taste in the whiskey.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Yumi. It's brilliant that you've brought up the highball, because that's the drink that I noticed everyone that came to the bar was ordering highballs, and everywhere you go to the izakaya after work and you're having some beautiful yakitori and everyone's there drinking their highballs, and it's just so different. It's the equivalent of beer almost, I tended to find out in Japan, where in the same way we might go and have a lager after work, people can go and drink whiskey and soda out in Tokyo or Kyoto or Osaka. And of course, as you say, that impacts the way that the blenders create their products, because if they know that the vast majority of the whiskey will be drunk in a highball, they need to make sure it tastes delicious in that longer style of drink. So thank you for raising that and for helping us understand why it's so important. Tadashi-san, I'd love to come to you and ask you if you have any thoughts or experience about how the whiskey culture in Japan differs to the rest of the world, and whether or not that impacts the way you as a master blender create your products for Nika.
Yeah, actually, so say Scotch people drink whiskey as a need. I very wonder, actually, in Spain, visited a bar, they're drinking J&B and cola. But in Japan, so Yumi said, almost most popular way to drink is still mizuwari or highball, because whiskey is drinking with meal in Japan, but other countries, as I say, after dinner or pre-dinner mixed with something like that. But in Japan, whiskey drinks with meal, that is introduced Suntory-san. Suntory-san visits every restaurant, like drink whiskey and mizuwari with meal. That's why we are drinking whiskey such way. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah, it's something we kind of touched on with Yumi, but you've really kind of clarified for us, which is that there's a real difference in the way that consumers perceive whiskey as an experience. I think here in the West, it's kind of a digestif, maybe something that the majority of consumers would imagine you have after dinner in front of a fireplace, and they enjoy in a kind of very slow, very serious way. Whereas in Japan, as you say, it's super common to have it alongside food. And when you're drinking it alongside food, as you mentioned, you often want to mix it with something to just make it a little bit lighter, a little bit more easier going. And you mentioned the difference between a highball and a mizuwari. I was wondering, for the sake of our audience, Tadashi-san, would you mind clarifying the difference between a mizuwari and a highball?
But actually, so recently very popular, getting popular in highball, but used to be maybe 30, 40 years ago, many people drink as highball. Then almost all Japanese people drinking mizuwari. Then say 8-9 years ago, also Suntory-san launched new way of highball that were increasing drink as a highball. Yeah.
So there we go. So we've seen several realms of popularity throughout the last 100 years or so of history, and you've got that more sparkling kind of soda-led version with a highball versus using kind of still mineral water to create that that kind of softer flavor of a Mizawari. So thank you for that, Tadashi-san. And last but not least, Mike, if you'd like to wrap up on this question and this topic for us in terms of the difference in whiskey drinking culture in Japan and the West, and how you think that impacts Suntory whiskies, but also the category more broadly.
Well, I think I must agree with Yumi-san's and Sakuma-san's opinions about the culture, drinking culture in Japan. And when Suntory started making whiskey and launched the whiskey, and also we figured out that Japanese taste is not as hard or strong as the Westerners, but then we learned how to make whiskey from Scotland. So we actually launched the whiskey around 40% ABV, but very difficult for average Japanese to enjoy such a strong alcoholic taste. And we, through the history of Suntory, we tried to create the whiskey drinking culture as Sakuma-san described, highball style. And so it was a big hit in 1960s, actually, 70s, maybe early 70s. And then move on to the Mizawari culture, which is adding the water to the whiskey. And that is successful because Japanese water is very good. Every tap water you use at the bar, the water itself is very good. And that's why, the whiskey is not really ruined by the water itself. And also particularly when Suntory tried to introduce the blended whiskey, which has to be, the blend whiskey, which shouldn't be deteriorated with the water addition. In order to overcome that problem, we used many different, styles of whiskeys in the blend, so that it's not easy to break up the taste itself. At the same time, we tried to find out why whiskey wouldn't be really accepted at the 40% ABV. We figured out that the shochu, which is Japanese spirits, even shochu can be enjoyed around 15% ABV. And we figured out, it's like a sake, Japanese sake, which is about 12 to 13% ABV, which is similar to wine alcohol. So in order to overcome the problems of the higher alcohol strengths, we thought that it would be a nice idea to actually add the water to the whiskey, and then whiskey alcohol percentage is down to maybe 12 to 13%, which is very, very acceptable to the average Japanese people. And that way, whiskey can go over the meals, like Japanese people, averagely enjoy the meal, enjoy the sake over the meals. That's a way we try to persuade Japanese restaurants to actually keep the whiskey and offer the whiskey with the water added. But since whiskey actually got too popular, so the whiskey was a bit actually how to say, people really felt tired about whiskey drinking then, and we had to face sort of a black age of 25 years or something. But nowadays, as Sakuma-san brought up. Thank you, Sakuma-san. And with effort by Suntory, introducing highball style with a new style of mug, which is like a drinking beer, and then attracted the youngsters who never thought of drinking whiskey before. They found out themselves that this is a very new style of drinking, although it existed 50 years ago. So it's cyclic. I think in the whiskey culture in Japan, I don't know if we could say we have a whiskey culture in Japan yet, only 100 years. But I think if we just do this, continue to do this cyclically, then we may actually establish Japanese whiskey culture in the near future.
That's so interesting. It's that idea of the kind of cyclical nature of fashion and trends. I think we saw a similar thing as bartenders with gin and tonic. So when I first started my career, that was considered a drink that only old people drank. And now we're obviously very much in the midst of a huge gin renaissance where everybody's drinking this gin. And it's interesting that the same happened with highballs in Japan. It was fashionable 50 years ago, then maybe it became less popular, and now once more it is the favorite way to drink whiskey. So thank you, Mike, for that insight, and thank you all three of you for your incredible insights throughout today's panel. We're actually going to kind of wrap it up there and just take this opportunity to reflect on what we've discussed today. There's been so much interesting content. There's been so many things that I'm sure everyone watching has learned today. So thank you all for taking the time and really making the effort to help us understand a little bit more about this incredible industry, this incredible category, this incredible region of Japanese whiskey. To briefly try my very best to headline or summarize, I think the key takeaways, which hopefully you'll agree is a good kind of summary of what we've discussed. In terms of the similarities and the differences between Japanese whiskey and traditional whiskey regions, I think one of the key takeaways I've noticed from all three of you is actually that in almost every regard, Japanese whiskey is really not that different from Scottish whiskey. We're using malted barley, we're using traditional fermentation methods, we're using traditional distillation in pot stills for malt whiskies, and of course in column stills for grain whiskies. We're aging in wood in the traditional way. And there's of course this real focus on making high quality, authentic whiskies following those traditional methods. So at its core, at its heart, there's this absolute respect for that heritage, I suppose, of whiskey making that we find in Scotland. So we find that there's this huge similarity. In terms, though, of maybe some minor or small divergences from the Scottish tradition that we see in Japan, they seem to me to fall into those three camps that you all brought out for us earlier. So firstly, returning to this idea of culture, we talked, Mike, you introduced us to the idea of creating whiskies designed or inspired by Japanese flavor preferences in terms of being delicate and refined and yet also having complexity. That was a fascinating insight. And we talked, of course, about the food culture of Japan and how these different flavors that people grow up with impact their preferences and the things that they enjoy in terms of their whiskey. We also talked about how the food culture is impacted the way we drink whiskey, because traditionally you'd have had maybe soshu with water or sake, and now we're mixing whiskey into long, refreshing serves. And that, of course, impacts the ways in which our blenders and our distillers create their products. And finally, we talked about the style of serve and the way that impacts the way consumers enjoy whiskey. So we've seen some huge impacts in terms of cultural differences. Tadashi, I was so pleased that you talked to us about the climactic differences as well, the impact of Japan's unique place on Earth. It has this hugely divergent set of seasons that create really rich, really tropical flavors in the whiskies. And we see such a difference going from Yuichi up in the far north in Hokkaido, down through Miyagi-Kyo, through Hakushu in the mountains, past Chichibu just off the side of Tokyo, and all the way down south to Yamazaki near Kyoto. And the huge difference in each of those different prefectures in terms of the weather, the temperature, the humidity, how those differences impact the varieties of whiskies available from different distilleries across Japan. And finally, we heard a little bit about the differences in terms of production, how these very small, these almost microscopic nuances in terms of fermentation tanks, whether they're wooden or stainless steel, different yeast strains that we heard about at Nika and at Suntory, still shapes, peating levels, and of course, different casks can all affect this plethora of different paints, as it were, that our master blenders, our painters can create these beautiful masterpieces that we call Japanese whiskies. So thank you all for those insights. I hope that everyone watching has learned at least something new today and has gained a deeper and more thorough understanding of what's certainly my favorite region for whiskey making, and I hope will become soon everybody's favorite, or at least one that we all love and respect as much as the four of us do. So I wanted to just thank all of you, Mike, Tadashi, Yumi, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your experience, your wisdom. And I just wanted to give you all just 30 seconds to say goodbye to everybody, to tell us where we can find you if we want to get more information, and just say goodbye to everybody from Tales of the Cocktail. So Yumi, I'll come to you first. Over to you.
Okay, so of course, I want you to try the flavor and taste of Japanese whiskey, but also most important thing for me is what you can see through the glass. So please enjoy nice whiskey with your friend.
Thank you, Yumi. Thank you so much. Tadashi, would you like to add any final thoughts?
Anyway, so to hear this program and watch a program that they understanding Japanese whiskey, and also they enjoy the whiskey of Japan. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I'll let you wrap up for us, Miyamoto-san.
Well, thank you very much for having us here in this event. And although COVID-19 actually kept you from coming to Japan, but actually after this, COVID-19, I would like you to come to Japan and visit some in bars and restaurants, enjoy the whiskey. So to me, whiskey is tasting is believing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And I think I can speak for myself, for all of the committee at Tales of the Cocktail, indeed, for every bartender watching. We cannot wait to visit you in Japan. Fingers crossed we'll all be able to see each other in person soon and drink a highball at one of Tokyo's many incredible bars. Thank you all. Arigatou gozaimasu, and I will see you hopefully very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.